What do we got?
Let's go ahead and get to some of what is unfolding around the country. Some extraordinary scenes. We want to start at Columbia University, which really has been kind of ground zero for these protests and for the crackdown on these protests. So we can put these images up on the screen. You're talking about the echoes of 1968. So here we have protesters taking over Hamilton Hall on campus. That was one of the same buildings that 1968.
Vosh, I'm from Saudi Arabia. I'm not sure what you want from the country other than to be invaded by Iran. I don't know why you're saying this or what prompted it or what you think or what you are, but sure, yeah, Iran invade it. Yeah, sure. Let's just arrive at that.
Anti-Vietnam War protesters took over at that time. You can see they have hung a flag that says Hins Hall. That's a reference to that little girl who, it was horrible. I did a whole monologue about it. She was in a car. Her family was killed by an IDF strike. She was still alive. She was able to call the Red Crescent. She was begging for them to come and help her. They stayed on the line with her. They got the route deconflicted so they could come and save her. And not only was she assassinated by the IDF, this little 6-year-old adorable girl, but her would-be rescuers also assassinated by the IDF. And, you know, documented on the scene that that ambulance coming to save her was just a block away. So
most moral army in history. Every single strike confirmed by like an elite court of philosophers and lawyers to make sure that it's ethically above board.
All in honor of Hind and her loss of life. So again, these echoes of 1968 now being very intentionally stoked, and that connectivity very intentionally created by the protesters at Columbia. I'll give you some more updates on Columbia in a minute because I want to show you some of the scenes out of UT Austin where Texas Governor Greg Abbott has decided to go full crackdown mode. Any of his pretenses around free speech clearly gone. Here you can see police taking out someone, carrying them. Their hands are bound. Here you see these officers coming in what appears to be riot gear, approaching the student protesters. Here you see
I saw this guy
beating the hell out of someone, fists flying there as you know, the cops are pushing up against the protesters. Here we see people being sprayed, mace, I assume, as they try to clear out this area.
You know why zip ties are used here instead of handcuffs? I never understood that. Because you can carry a bunch of zip ties, but not a bunch of handcuffs at once. Zip ties just do the job fine. It's just like cheap and easy, and they're much lighter and more effective.
Encampment. And then this is incredible. So after the police cleared the whole area, this is protesters coming back in and the police actually having to retreat. And then this is my favorite. I don't know if you guys can hear this in the background, but they're chanting, "You failed, Uvalde," because DPS was there on the scene at Uvalde. And while they're pretty courageous when it comes to beating up unarmed college kids, not so courageous when it came to rescuing these poor babies who were trapped and being murdered inside of that elementary school and ultimately bleeding out.
True.
So just extraordinary scenes there. I don't know how many arrests were made, but student protesters at UT Austin very determined, even in spite of the crackdown, to come back in and reset up the encampment, restart.
This is a pretty good setup. Somebody says the debate starts at 7 minutes. Okay, let's see how Saagar ruins this. So here we Saagar sort of like at the conflicted intersection of, you know, well, the far right, which I'm a part of, he says, I didn't say that, clips, he said that, he says that, it's him. Well, he doesn't actually say that. I'm saying that on his behalf. I'm speaking for him. Thank you. So, you know, you've got the Nazis and the anti-Semites and stuff, but we also have fascism, which we love. That's also something he's saying. I'm saying this for him. Yeah, let's see where he lands.
Which is what you're pointing to is, and this is why it was such a mistake to initially send in the NYPD.
Absolutely.
Because initially, this is a peaceful protest. Yes, they're in violation of rules, but they sent in the cops, and then there was a huge backlash, and then they tried negotiation. And that's a big mistake because, as you said, you're suspending people, you're sending in the cops, and you're kind of boxing people into a corner, but then you're giving them deadlines, you're not enforcing the deadlines because you're obviously, look, these people, they have no idea what to do. They're terrified of the headline of sending in the NYPD, again, inviting a new backlash. And so they kind of ratcheted up the...
This is before... Yeah, this is before the crackdown on Columbia University that we covered at the beginning of this stream.
I mean, if you think about it, and this is a bad analogy, but it's like a prison, right? So it's like when you have good behavior and then you have a violation of that. I just watched that whole Unlocked thing on Netflix, but it's very instructive about how people feel, and like you were saying about enforcement and rules is, okay, if you have a medium infraction, it should be met with a medium-sized reasonable response. So the reasonable response at that time would have been to do what they did in the interim, which is meet with them and be like, okay, guys, like what's going on here? Hey, we have commencement in 2 weeks. You're all going home. If you don't clear out, you're going to get suspended. It's going to be a problem, and you don't want that. You've paid all this money. You know, we have all this going on. And I think, you know, we're talking about lowering tension. But they threw the cops in. That was a huge mistake. That said, now, though, you know, by boxing people into a corner and also kind of both throwing the cops. And
okay, so far the discourse seems pretty reasonable. I'm not here to just watch the video. When do they start disagreeing? Hold on. I'm going to skip a little bit further ahead. What's going on here? I feel like I'm content stealing right now.
Feed you or your kids. I mean, ask some of these Vietnam War people how it all worked out for them in 20 years later, so 1988. We elected Reagan. You know, we had Iran-Contra and all that. Like, did it really make a difference? What happened to a lot of those folks? Not much. Petered out. Nixon got elected. Law and order, sky-high murder rates, mostly backfired. Let's be real.
It's such a cynical view of the world, though, to say, like, basically nothing matters. No protest matters. Your genuine concern about this. You're protesting of the government. You're disrupting political speeches. Nothing you do matters. So just like go out and get your bag. I think that's a really cynical and disturbing view of the world.
Nothing matters, but a very little does matter.
Listen,
this is obviously like a really dumb and cynical point of view. Obviously, protests make a huge difference. It's a massive country. It's a massive world with a lot of people in it. Sometimes it feels like it doesn't make a difference. Sometimes it doesn't make a difference, but it can make a difference. You know, this like nothing ever happens approach is funny and amusing when applied to geopolitics, but the idea that protest on its own isn't worthwhile is just like really dumb. It had an impact on the Vietnam War. It had an impact on the civil rights movement. Just because Reagan got voted in later doesn't change either of those facts. That's not how that works, you know? I would argue if you want long-lasting success, an individual protest isn't sufficient. A protest has to be substantiated in its content with an ideology that meaningfully addresses and supports like long-term improvement. This is one of the reasons why we don't think as well of the anti-Vietnam War protests like in the long term, and it's because a lot of those protesters were hippies, and the hippie movement was very ideologically inconsistent. It was mostly, as far as I'm concerned, a bunch of like yuppies and trust fund kids who wanted a break from their like, you know, stifling expectations and their bullish conservative parents, you know, engaged in a kind of broader cultural practice that overlapped with opposition to the Vietnam War. But it wasn't like a substantial ideology of peace. And for that reason, you know, I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of those hippies went on to become like Reagan voters. Meanwhile, to this day, the black population is overwhelmingly Democrat voting. That's because the ideology of the civil rights movement, of black liberation, was fundamentally liberating. The underlying ideology was substantial enough that you could defer to it in future incidents when stuff gets bad again, and it could at the very least direct you in somewhat of a reliable pattern, right? It's not like black people then went on to all vote for Reagan or whatever, right? So yeah, that's what I think. I think it needs to be substantiated.
Here's the bottom line. We know what will happen if these protests don't proceed, if these kids don't risk the things that they're risking that, again, I think they should be absolutely commended for. We know what will happen. Absolutely nothing. We don't know what will happen if they try. And we've seen at least that there has been some pressure placed on the administration, and I think that's important. And we see globally, this is another thing I have in my monologue.
I would say, considering the fact that these protests have only been really going on for like a week, they've been going on longer than that, but in terms of like the big attention given, the attention and impact they've had already is pretty huge, you know? I would say, given the timeline we're talking about here, oftentimes these counter protests, they go on for months and months and months. So, you know, I don't know. I feel like this is pretty big so far. Good start.
We see that the people in Gaza see them. These Palestinians in Gaza are being starved to death and threatened with bombing, and the entire male population in Rafah now basically threatened with execution and murder. They see these protests, and it means something to them. I mean, that alone is, I think, significant and important. And you see the way that international pressure, I mean, you see the way Netanyahu is kind of freaking out about the fact that there's international pressure, and these students are part of that larger movement. So yeah, there are no guarantees here. You're right. There was a backlash to the Vietnam War protesters, and you're right, that could happen again. But we know damn well what happens if these kids do nothing. And that is the status quo perseveres, Palestinians are probably, kicked out of their land altogether, continue to be murdered, continue to be slaughtered. We know that's what happens if they don't protest. They think there's a chance they could change something, and I applaud them for doing it.
They may be right. I think they're wrong. I think it's a
But like, what? Why not? Like, what's the argument here? We've already seen a massive shift in the American public's perception of Israel just over the past few months. Why would you? What basis is there for arguing against it, even if the chance is slim? Which I don't think is the case. Even if I think the chance is slim, I still think that's an argument for it, right? Like, oh, there's only a small chance you might make the world better. I don't know.
Reading of history and of power and of how that all works. Now, again, I would take it back. I don't want to scold people. I would only give you some advice that when you're very young, it can be real easy to get caught up in whatever the current thing of the day is. I'm trying to think back from 2012 or whatever, whenever I was in college. DACA, that was a big one. All right, people march for DACA. All this was all over. Sorry, look, it ended up working out. Nothing. Like, I'm just asking people to have a little bit of historical literacy and to be mindful that actions are going to have consequences. Now, you're an adult.
This is such a non-statement. First of all, you would think somebody who is, again, a fascist would argue for like moral virtue on its own account. Just because there's a small chance of succeeding, does that mean you shouldn't do something that is good? Why? How does that follow at all? Second of all, the idea that a person would be historically illiterate if they were of the belief that student protests have a chance of making a difference. Not all protests succeed, some do. I would say the success of the civil rights movement in and of itself is sufficient to demonstrate the validity of protest against injustice for centuries ahead, Like, all it takes is one big issue to be meaningfully altered, for the positive outcome to be that which happens, and that's it.
You do whatever you want to do, and I support your right to do that, and I've spoken here openly. I support people's right to protest and all that. I would just caution folks to not get caught up into thinking, this ain't 1966 in Selma, Alabama and all that, and there's too often,
Why not? Wait, why? Okay, it's not 1966. Why does it not apply? Why?
Lack of thinking about these consequences. Let's think back to BLM. I mean, people took to the streets. They thought this was going to be a revolution. What's the actual lasting consequence? You almost got Donald Trump reelected. You have a sky-high murder rate, and nothing changed.
Murder rate is not even remotely sky-high. Thank you. Almost got Donald Trump elected. What is that?
In terms of police action. So I hope you felt better, but that's pretty much it. And a bunch of grifters got to buy mansions in Los Angeles. Like, you didn't change anything.
Is that where his mansion is? Saagar, is that where you bought your mansion in? The only grifters that really made money off of BLM were all of the conservative pundits pretending the entire country had burned down, okay? Just because, like, 2 people from an org ended up making money from it? Like, Jesus Christ, come on. Yeah, this juxtaposition is literally nothing you do matters, but also your actions have consequences. How?
Arguing for, give up.
No,
that is your view.
Understand politics.
That is what you're arguing. Yeah. Give up. Don't try. Don't bother. If you care about something, you know what? Keep your mouth shut, stay home, and go get your bag. That's what you're arguing for. And I think, listen, the reality is we know how hard it is to have our democracy actually reflect what people want and the will of the people. But I don't know why you're even doing what you're doing here and caring about politics if you think that nothing ever matters and nothing ever...
Because he's the grifter. When people tell you that nothing you do matters, what they're essentially telling you is they're one of two things. Either A, they are telling you to be quiet. I sincerely doubt Saagar would say nothing matters when talking about, say, conservative causes that have a long shot to be victorious on his end, Like, for one. And the second thing is they're admitting that they don't actually believe in the project of political change. They're only engaged in this to make the money. And Saagar makes a lot of money, If you believe that nothing you do matters, then shut up. Then stop. Like, it's just entertainment then. I don't think Saagar actually believes that. I just think that you're not going to get anything done anyway is the standard 50 IQ response to seeing student protesters do their best,
Changes. Obviously, we've had protest movements in our history that have mattered and have changed. We can look back at LGBTQ rights in the very recent past, where there was an organized movement and there was protest. And guess what? Change came and it mattered and it happened. The Black Lives Matter protest situation.
Okay, yeah, it's worth noting basically every major positive change in our government and in progressive rights was predicated by like a long wave of protests and support at the ground level. Like everything good that has happened was fought for on some level, okay? Nothing good just happens for no reason. It doesn't just poof like out of the ether, you know?
I think part of what happened there and led to a backlash that you're right, absolutely nothing changed is number one, the co-optation, as you said, by grifters. Number two, the lack of any sort of like organized specific demands. And number three, the fact that in direct contrast to these protests, you actually had real widespread violence and property destruction and damage. You have not had that here.
No, I totally agree. And I commend these people. I said it from the beginning. I'll explain then, why am I sitting here? Because I want to convince people and understand how power really works in this country and the ways in which it can change. So let's think about the civil rights era. There's a great series of books called The Parting of the Waters. It's three series. I highly recommend people read it. A misreading of history is to think that Martin Luther King Jr. in the Selma, Alabama march is the only thing that mattered. And it's totally wrong. The NAACP, working with Lyndon Johnson and with the U.S. Senate over a period of 25 years in the legislative process, using the protest movement to then specifically co-opt and hit the powers of center that mattered, actually resulted in the 1964 Civil Rights Act on top of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. It was the perfect moment for it to actually be able to come through. That's how it worked, right? So it's not just taking to the streets. Now, right. I'm not going to...
yeah, okay. Yeah, massive social change is complicated and predicated by a lot. So does that mean that taking to the streets wasn't a part of all that? Like what? Like is his implication that you could have removed the civil rights protests from the civil rights movement and still would have gotten the outcome? Like obviously these things work in tandem.
Diminish the people who took to the streets.
Right.
He's saying we have to assassinate RFK to get progress. You actually have to sacrifice a Kennedy every time you want something good to happen.
But they're not actually the ones who really changed anything.
Well,
it was LBJ, and it was the people, Hubert Humphrey, and other
cocktail.
Yes,
so what? They didn't matter. I mean, come on,
they
that's
mattered a lot. They mattered a lot less than the NAACP and the Lyndon Johnson, Hubert Humphrey, and the leaders.
But you're pretending.
See, yeah, this is just really, really, really stupid rhetoric. Honestly, like. Hey, you naive student protester, I bet you think that a protest literally single-handedly did everything good with no other influence. Well, you're wrong. In actuality, there were a combination of forces that led to the passing of the Civil Rights Act. Okay, goodbye. Yeah, great.
Like what's happening in Colombia is the only thing happening in the entire country.
No, I
mean, again, this movement has already won the argument. This movement has already dramatically changed public opinion, especially in terms of young people. This movement has made it so that for the first time, candidates like Summer Lee can actually be out and out oppositional to critical of Israel, and AIPAC didn't even try to defeat her because they knew she was too strong, she was going to win. For the first time, there is actual political weight on the side of Palestinians where it's only been on one side previously. So those are all changes that are being made. And by the way, as I said, this is not the only thing that's happening. You also have organizations that are forming, that have formed, that are designed to put money on the other side of the equation, organize on the other side of the equation. You have unions that have gotten involved who have come out in favor of ceasefires and putting their organizational weight and might behind it. So to pretend like this is the only thing that's happening, and so, so it's not going to matter, to pretend that protests just haven't ever mattered in history.
Is she reading from a script? No, Krystal is genuinely a smart woman and is pretty good at putting together an argument when she wants to. I can't fault her for that. Honestly, every time I've seen her for the past year, she's been cooking pretty well,
Just think that is, I think it's preposterous, I think it's nihilistic, and I just think it's ahistorical.
I don't think that it doesn't matter. I think that it is part of a broader whole. And I would urge
nobody disagrees with that.
People to not overestimate what part of one whole is and underestimate the other. I completely agree with you.
I never underestimate holes.
On the union part, on the Congress part, and that, why do we spend so much time here? That shit really does matter. Like who really votes for X, Y, A to Ukraine? Why do you think we spend so much time here? Or I care so much about Congress and the way that Ukraine aid matters and explaining all this shit about parliamentary procedure, because that's the stuff that really governs our lives. Like me.
Is fascist liberal a thing? What does it mean to be like an anti-populist fascist obsessed with proceduralism? I don't know. Maybe he just wants the bag.
Taken to the streets, and if I started an anti-Ukraine war protest, which I would love to participate in, if anybody ever wants to let me know the next one that is happening.
Oh, but why? It wouldn't matter.
But that's my point. It wouldn't do anything. It actually wouldn't do anything. Now, if I spend some of my time here and I win the argument and I try and work, pressure lawmakers to actually do something, that's going to be a little bit different. And explain to the people.
Why would lawmakers be pressured if there weren't massive public protests to point to as evidence of the popularity of your cause? How do you pressure lawmakers if you're just an individual single person going, hey, lawmaker, you should do this thing? The whole point of protesting is to rally like solidarity and collective interest and attention, which then leads to greater pressure. Like, this is very 101 stuff, man.
People hear about how some of that stuff works, and to the limited extent that we actually have a check in our huge democratic system, that is a real understanding, I think, of kind of how the power works. Again, when you're 21 years old, you don't have any power regardless. So yeah, this is probably your best bet in terms of participating in the whole. I am only saying you should also think about your future and what it's like in the, you know, in a way, it's a little bit nihilistic to think.
Such a waffling non-statement, man.
That me getting expelled from school over participating or, you know, breaking down a Hamilton Hall window is going to change the world. Like, I'm sorry. You know?
That's what? Believing as a student protester that engaging in a protest might change the world is nihilism. That's the opposite of nihilism. That's you're doing like revolutionary spirit shit. That's not nihilistic at all. What are you waffling about? What are you talking about, man?
You know, the most likely outcome is that you're screwed 10 years from now. Nobody remembers. You don't have a degree. You got expelled, and now you're, what, $150,000 in debt. You know, I worry about those people too. I mean, I'm certainly, how are they going to be able to buy a house or whatever? Actually, the single worst situation you can be in is
nobody is buying a house anyway.
Have no degree and all of the attendant Ivy League school debt, which no wonder a lot of these people are going to be in. That's just, you know, in a way, that's nihilism as well. Thinking that this is the most important thing.
He meant nihilism. He didn't mean to say narcissism. He meant nihilism.
It's ever going to happen in your life. The truth is, it's not. Almost by a large.
Stand up for the things that you believe in, and you're willing to bear a cost and a consequence, I think, is what we call like courage, and is admirable. And yeah, they know that there is a potential price that they are paying. They're not stupid. They're quite aware of that. Their administration of Columbia has made them quite aware of that. The political elites, the media class, have made them quite aware of that. And Bill Ackman threatening to keep them from ever being hired. Like, that shit already happened, being doxxed and smeared. Why do you think they all wear masks at the protest? That's why, okay? They're very well aware of the consequences, and they're doing it anyway. And I think they deserve to be commended for that. If we can move on to the next element, though, to update on what Columbia is actually doing.
Okay, yeah. This has always been one of the most frustrating and cynical types of dampening the spirits of people who want to make the world a better place, which is with this like insistence that it doesn't make a difference at all. You will feel better if you participate, okay? I think that you should think of your future. I think that you should be careful and considerate of your image and of the consequences of debt or expulsion or a criminal record. But I also think that like the evidence overwhelmingly points to the idea that not only does hope in the potential for change move mountains, but it also emboldens the spirit and makes you a stronger person. Also, Krystal did pretty well. Good job, Krystal.